Thank you, and thank you to Bob for inviting me this evening, and thanks to the O'Keeffe Museum for hosting this lovely room, and thank you all for coming. So this is a little different kind of talk than I think usually happens here because this is a science cafe. But the topic tonight is conservation, and conservation is not it's not really a physical science, it's a social science. And we're going to be just briefly touching on some physical topics tonight and then moving on to the social aspects of conservation of wildlife and wild systems. So the topics we'll cover tonight are a little bit on otter ecology, not much at all really, and then some discussion of top predators, because I know that you have been talking about predators in some of these talks. There was a beautiful wolf talk by Dave Parsons, and I know that people have given talks on food webs and so on, so I'll talk a little bit about that. And then as an illustration, the story of the sea otters off of the coast of California, and then two very nice recovery stories about otters. So there are 13 species worldwide, and everybody I talk to says, oh, but there aren't otters where I live, but there actually are otters almost everywhere in the world. Australia doesn't have any placental mammals, any kind of mammals that we recognize as normal. But otherwise, they're in the coldest places, the hottest places, everywhere where there's water. And there's an outfit called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and I'm going to talk about that later. One of the things they do is maintain a list of all the species in the world that people have worked in so that they can classify the status. Is it endangered? Is it safe? Is it threatened? And so on. And so this is a status of otters. It's not actually that great. There are 13, 4 are endangered, including the sea otter. 2 are vulnerable, which is near the tipping point into endangered. 1 is near threatened, which is a little behind that. The ones that are of least concern are actually the otter we have in North America, the so-called river otter, and 2 African species. It never fails to amaze me how African species with the state of Africa politically managed to hang on. They still have some very large animals in Africa. And 10 of them have a declining trend. This is the conservation issue we've got here. We're worried about that. So just a little about otters themselves as a general group. Morphology, which means shape. They are completely adapted for hunting fish in water, hunting food in water. So they have this beautiful, sleek, tapering shape with little ears and a tail which is quite strong for ruddering, webbed feet. This is physiology here, but they can reduce their heart rate. They have a lot of adaptations for spending a lot of time in water. They're very social. I'm sure when you've seen photographs of them, they're together with other otters. They hang out in these big piles for mostly. They're very, very efficient at getting fish, although they prefer to get the slower, bigger fish because that's easier for them. And so that matters when we're talking about prey. But they'll eat almost anything they can get their hands on. They love crayfish, which are these kind of lobster-like things down here, which we have in our rivers in New Mexico. They'll eat snakes and frogs and ducks and anything they come across, but something like 90% or more of their diet is fish or crayfish. They don't live very long. There's high mortality. Oh dear. Oh, so cute, okay. Yeah, I mean, youngsters, there might even be 75% mortality. And so they only have, on average, about 2 cubs that they raise, and so populations expand slowly. And they have to be taught to swim in a pretty brutal way. You know, it's as if you dragged your 4-year-old into the water and just held them down there. So the thing that I think maybe you came to see tonight was these cute otters. Otters are unbelievably charismatic, not only the way they look, which is absurd, they're like a little Disney character, but they behave in these incredibly playful, adorable ways that, I mean, they know how to have fun, okay? And we love animals that know how to have fun.
Would you mind using that?
Oh, no. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me yet? This is not on, huh? Were you having trouble hearing me? Hello? Hello? Okay. So, yeah, they're very cute, but they are also the top predators, meaning the group at the top which eats everything else and nobody eats them. So rarely an otter will be taken by a wolf or something, but it is rare indeed. And in many ecosystems, they are the top predator, in virtually all their ecosystems. And this is a little video I'm going to show you. I want you to know that nothing bad happens in this video. It's David Attenborough from BBC talking, and this is a video taken in India. I just want you to see that besides being charismatic and adorable, they can be quite fierce. And there's a big mugger crocodile, which they're trying to chase out of their terrain. Go ahead. Click. It's not moving anywhere, though. Sorry. They're quite noisy, otters are. They're very squeaky. No? You should just be able to push the... Okay. Let's not do it. Okay, what they did is, these are small-clawed otters. They're the smallest otters, only about 10 pounds, and they gang up together on this 30-foot-long crocodile to chase him out. And he's biting at them, and they're running away. Maybe it was the audio that prevented that. Okay, so let's just talk for a minute about what it means to be a top predator. Top predators structure the entire ecosystem below them, just the way wolves do. And when you take the top predator out, you get a lot of very funny things happening. We've always had a hard time with predators because we see them as a threat. Most of them are more threatening, like wolves, like mountain lions that attack people, and so on. Otters are really top predators without being very threatening to people. They're only in the water. Attacks on humans have been almost unknown. They have, otters with rabies or something like that. Otherwise, they're kind of out of our ken. We don't really worry about them. So the main threats to them have been hunting and trapping for their fur, and also because some people hunt them because they eat fish, and people like to hang on to their fish. Habitat fragmentation, pollution of water, and reduced prey base all have to do with the fact that they live in water, and the human race likes to be near water, uses it, takes water out of the river, and in other ways, impacts otter populations. And the way top predators structure the whole food base below them is really interesting, and I'm going to show you a really nice illustration of that. They're called keystone species. I think we've talked about keystone species before. This is an arch. You guys know where the keystone is on this? This is the keystone. That's why they're called keystone species. What happens if you take that stone out? The whole thing falls apart. Crash, exactly. So we're looking at ecosystems that crash in the same way when you take the otters out. And we find that where there are top predators, like wolves and panthers and otters, that there's higher diversity, more species, that the whole ecosystem is more complex and often more productive. And I know you talked about trophic levels before, and so some illustrations of trophic levels. This is the one that the wolf talked about. When you take the wolves out of the system, the top predator, the moose explode, moose population, and then everything under that gets hammered by the moose, like the willow shrubs. And the same is true for otters who eat crayfish. And the crayfish, if their population is allowed to explode because you take the otters out, the small fish get hammered, the invertebrates, bugs, the algae, practically everything in the river system. So we're going to talk as an illustration about sea otters. You guys all know sea otters, right? These are actually the largest otters. They weigh over 100 pounds. They're really quite big. And, well, not as big actually as, probably heavier than giant otters, but not as long. So they are the keystone species in an ecosystem I'm going to describe. They live on the whole arc of the northern Pacific, from Kamchatka up through the Alaskan islands down, because you know that they were very impacted by the Valdez oil spill, and down through Canada and all the way down the California coast. They live their entire lives in the sea. Okay? They don't come on land for any reason. And in this case, and we'll talk about this further, but these are orcas. You recognize those orcas? Orca whales. They're actually porpoises. In some cases, they eat the sea otters here, and that's an unusual case, and we'll look at why. They're known for having their babies in the water and floating and keeping their babies all the time on them, except when they hunt. You see how extremely fluffy they are. And they love sea urchins. And some people eat sea urchins. Japanese love sea urchins too. But the sea otters, it's their preferred food. And they dive to the bottom, they pick them up, and they come up and they smash them open with a rock. Has anybody ever seen a YouTube video of that? You know, it looks very sophisticated. They're just munching away. They do very well. And this environment that they live in the ocean is cold water, and the habitat is a kelp forest. This is kelp. It's actually an algae, but it's hundreds of feet long, attached to the bottom with something called a holdfast. It has to stay attached to the bottom because if it gets cut loose, then it gets washed up on the shore and dies. So this is the environment, very rich environment. There's a lot of nutrients and cold water. And there's fish, and there's sea lions, and there's just lots of stuff. And on top, the urchin-eating otters. This is just a picture of the holdfast, which holds on to the bottom of the sea. So because they live in a cold place, they have to stay warm, and they have incredibly dense fur. 1 million hairs per square inch is almost unimaginable to me, but it actually means that they are always dry. The water never touches their skin. Otherwise, they'd become hypothermic, and they wouldn't be able to do what they do. So this became very, very popular. Otter and beaver throughout the whole New World, in fact, became very popular in Europe and then in the East Coast. So you see the size of these things with these incredibly dense furs. They were very, very popular. And of course, this is a typical kind of thing that happened. In London, it just crashed down to almost zero at the beginning of this century, wiped out the otters off the coast of California. This wasn't the only wipeout, however. Look at the dates here, 1950 to 2010. These are other huge marine crashes. Whale biomass, at first protected, but then crashing. Harbor seals, and the harbor seals and the sea lions are interesting for a reason we'll look at. Look at the sea otter line. Really almost straight down. We're not quite sure what caused all of this. It's a combination of factors. Yeah?
Earlier slide, there was a spike upward in our population.
It was sales.
Sales as a population.
I thought that was population.
Oh, yeah, sales. But, you know, it dropped because the population dropped right there, too. Yeah. So a complex of factors, more difficult to deal with than we had thought. Certainly oil spills. There's a lot of oil being drilled off of the California coast. Apparently, people were putting kitty litter in their sewage. This got washed out. Some of you heard this story. Got washed out to sea. Cat feces had diseases that killed off the otters. There were a lot of problems. We haven't got a handle on it, But when the otters got wiped out over and over again, they stopped eating urchins, right? Or there were too few of them to eat very many urchins. This turned out to be a much bigger impact than we could possibly have predicted. So the urchins, which prefer to eat the holdfasts, goodness only knows why. Well, they're crawling along the bottom. I suppose it's a nice big piece of vegetable matter. But when the otters were taken away, the urchins multiplied. They started gobbling up the holdfasts. You can imagine what happens next, right? Yeah, bigger impact than we could have imagined, right? They decimated the whole kelp forest, wiped it out, and multiplied themselves. I'm sure they've got a population crash coming here themselves. And this is a nice little illustration of it. Here's the original situation. The sea otter eats the urchins, which means that the holdfasts hold the kelp in place. And over here, we have no sea otters, lots of urchins, and no kelp. But this also illustrates something else here, because this was written for, this is a recent paper, written for another reason. Here we have kelp carbon pool, because the kelp is being productive. Remember I said productivity is something that matters with top predators? This is a very productive system, because the kelp is fixing carbon, producing algae tissue. Over here, we have a very small carbon pool. So this paper was written only about a year ago, saying sea otter populations actually impact climate change issues. It's allowing more, or it's actually not allowing the fixation of carbon in a very large habitat all up and down the California coast, and who knows, perhaps around the arc of the. So this is a beautiful illustration of the impact of taking top predators out of the system. You can really change everything kind of overnight. And this is just, I said that we're having trouble getting a handle on why, we protected them at the cost of millions of dollars and a big effort, and still we don't see, that line should be going up, but it's not. And we see a lot of sea otters dying in California. So this is, there's a word for this or a phrase called trophic cascade. So when I showed you that slide of, say, the wolves eating the moose and the moose eating the aspen, that's a cascade, as if water were going, down a cliff like this. And so the cascade can be interrupted by taking out the top and letting the system go haywire. So this is what happens. The kelp plant floats away. All the other species are impacted. Productivity declines. CO2 fixation declines. But if we can get the otters back in there, we can restore the system. So I'm going to talk now, this is a purely conservation aspect. This is a social science topic we're talking about now. But we have spent a lot of energy trying to conserve otters and other top predators. And I'm going to tell you two stories about situations where we put the otters back after the trophic cascade was interrupted. Giant otters in South America, these kind of funny goggly-eyed looking guys right here, and our own otters, which are called river otters, which, how many people think we have river otters in New Mexico? Okay, we have river otters in New Mexico, and we'll tell you the story. So the restoration of river otters in the state is very recent. It's only in the last 5 years. But they were killed off quite a long time ago. They really mainly were wiped out in the 19th century by hunting, and particularly because beavers are in the rivers that otters are in, and they actually are very closely associated because otters like to fish in the ponds that beavers make. And this is Bill DeBuise, who's one of our local authors, wrote this, and I'm really struck by the fact that, you see, the illustration here illustrates that otters have been taken for a long, long time, and beavers. 3 centuries of hunting for otters in the state and in the West. But this was Mexico in 1838. And there was so much beaver trapping with a bycatch of otters, and both populations just dropped, that the junta in Mexico actually declared this moratorium on hunting in 1838. Bill thinks that this is one of the earliest conservation acts in North America, here in the state. It wasn't a state, but nevertheless. So the last known otter that we have, actually, the only specimen in the state, it's over at Fish and Game, it's stuffed, you can see it in their lobby, was killed in 1953 in the Gila River. Everybody know where the Gila is? It's down the southwest corner of the state. It's not a very big river. But there was a restoration project from 2008 to 2010, which released 33 otters in the upper Rio Grande. The otters came from Washington State, where they would have been killed as nuisance otters. You can call up, like you can call up the government anywhere and say, I have an animal I don't like, would you please come kill it? Believe it or not. And people called and said, please get rid of our otters. So now they've been released and they're going everywhere. We transported them very, very carefully because otters get very excited and they don't like to feel trapped. They have to be kept really cool and quiet. So we flew some by plane. We took some in cars and released them here in the really beautiful Rio Pueblo de Taos, just above the junction with the Rio Grande, thinking that they would go downstream. Some of them actually went upstream into Taos. One of them actually ate $4,000 worth of koi in somebody's pond in Taos. But I ran into her, actually, and serendipitously, and I said, oh, I'm so sorry about your koi. She said, oh, well, you know, otters are really nice. That's all right. And on Taos Pueblo land, and Taos Pueblo was a good partner in this project. So we built these boxes for them to rest up. These are actually the transport containers, and they were fitted in there, and they were allowed to go in there. And there was hay and water and fish, and they got to rest up. And then we released them. They weren't all together too clear about what was going to happen when we released them. They didn't know where they were. But there were no mortalities, which was really good because they often they get so excited they just kill themselves. This is our very first otter, Rocky, who came out, a great big male. And the one thing I want to say about this project is you're seeing the people who restored otters. It was a very loose coalition of environmentalists that came together for this project only and then dispersed. So Amigos Bravos, the Four Corners Institute, Sierra Club, New Mexico Defenders of Wildlife, Taos Pueblo, and also the Department of Game and Fish. But we paid for the whole thing. Otherwise, it never would have happened. The department was not all that keen about it, really. It's not completed yet. This is the Gila River, at a little bit low water. It does have more water sometimes. And the Game Commission approved them being released here, but we're not doing it at the moment, mostly for political reasons, actually. There are some issues. There are populations of endangered fish species, I think 3 or maybe 4 if there's been another one listed. But they tend to be very, very small, like this one. Otters are not interested. Or very fast, like the Gila trout. There are, in all rivers, in all of the United States, actually, lots of exotic fish that tend to be larger, slower, stupider. Those are the fish that otters really focus on, and not the native swift fish. And the Gila has these, what are they? Anybody know? Crayfish, exactly. It looks very large there, but they're only about this big. They're exotics. There's only one native crayfish in the States, in the Canadian River, which has hardly any water. These guys are absolutely devastating for an ecosystem. They eat just everything. They eat small fish, they eat fish eggs, they eat plant matter. They just make a desert out of it, and the fishermen hate these guys. And these, again, are one of the preferred. I mean, in fact, otters will eat 100% crayfish if they have the chance. And we believe that putting otters back in here would completely change the nature of this river and really clean it up. So we're hoping and waiting to get them down there. If any of you want to see otters, you know where Pilar is? If you turn at Pilar and you drive on that state road alongside the river for maybe 10 miles, right next to the river, that's a very good place to see otters, especially early in the morning, 7, 8, and in the evening. I've driven down there and seen them. People see them, rafters see them all the time. And they're a little bit shy, but not very, really. And along that stretch, we've had a mother and cubs denning. So if you ever want to see an otter, take a raft trip up there. This is, yeah.
Do you think there are now?
Oh, that's a very good question. Looky here. This is actually cut off here, but pink means we don't know. We don't know. Actually, to their credit, the Department of Game and Fish there's a program called Share with Wildlife, which funds research on wildlife in the state. And for a couple of years now, they have, in their request for proposals, said, we would like somebody to put in a proposal to monitor the otters. It's very difficult to assess abundance. Distribution is easy. You look for tracks and scat, but abundance of otters, it's very, very difficult. You really have to have a long-term project. You have to sit in one place with a lot of camera traps. So we don't know. We would love somebody to monitor them, but it's not an easy task. The general picture here you get looking at this too. 22 states have restored them. We were actually the last. But, expanding and stable is most of the continent. So we're really doing a good job taking care of our otters, as we do compared to the rest of the world, for a lot of our wildlife. Oop. So here's the second story I'm going to tell, also an optimistic story. These are giant otters. I actually, a couple summers ago, spent some time down there monitoring these guys. That's a great experience. If you ever get really, really dry, and you can't stand it here anymore, go to the Amazon. There is more water. I mean, I couldn't believe how much water there is down there. And a lot of very good habitat for these giant otters, in theory. They really are big. 6 feet, which is what we are, and they used to be bigger, probably still are some 8-footers out there. These are real obvious predators. They're not at all shy. Powerful. These are powerful animals. That's an Amazonian fish, huh? They get up to 300 pounds, and the fish, can drag you down to the bottom and wait for you to drown. Water is a very dangerous place in the Amazon. They're widely distributed, although there are really not a lot of them. There are probably about 5,000 now, but again, we really don't have a good handle on how many there are. This is flooded forest, seasonally flooded. It's an amazing forest. The water rises during the rainy season about 40 feet. So most of the trees are inundated up to their treetops. And I remember seeing a film quite a while ago where they got into the water, God bless them. And you see fish swimming among the tree trunks. And a lot of the trees actually rely on fish eating them and chewing up the hard outer shell in order to germinate. So this is kind of otter heaven, unless somebody is bothering them. It's a very big distribution, as you see. They're very, very social. They have groups that come together for 2 or 3 or 4 more years with the cubs and maybe the grown-up cubs too. Here's a cub begging for some food. They're kind of funny looking, aren't they? They have these. They're not as adorable as the regular old kind of otter. But they have this very interesting thing. First of all, they're not at all shy, so that I was sitting in a boat that was only a couple of inches off the water, one of these dugouts, down low. And they come swimming, they find you, they see you, and they come swimming right up, 4 or 5 or 8 of them. And they stick their heads out of the water like this, and they look at you. Who is this here in my territory? And they recognize people. They know who you are. I mean, they know if you're a stranger. And they have these markings, as you see, very distinctive. They videotape them, and then they make, the researchers make catalogs of who's there, who's with who's gone off into another group, and they actually can keep really good track of these guys because they're quite, they're not retiring animals at all. This is just a den, what their dens look like. They carve out many chambers in the bank and have a kind of fidelity. This is what happened to them when there was this spree of otter hunting for pelts. 1946 to 1973, this is actually the number of pelts here, just dropped basically to 0. They couldn't find any more, so they stopped hunting them. And then, right about the same time, there was a new treaty, actually a very, very important treaty signed, an international treaty. So many countries in the end ended up signing this international treaty, CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna. And it is currently the major mechanism for conserving wildlife internationally. It doesn't matter so much in the US, except for the imports, but worldwide it's come to be a very, very important document. There are appendices, 3 of them actually. Number 1, if you're on the list, Appendix 1, you are not allowed to be traded internationally. Okay, so elephants, for example, you know, lots of things, tigers and so on. You can't legally trade, internationally trade, the animals on Appendix 1. Appendix 2 is not so great condition. Appendix 3 is safe animals to trade. So in 1973, the giant otters were put on Appendix 1 even before the treaty was actually put in full force. Okay? So they were one of the first animals put on this treaty. And because otters reproduce slowly, and there are other challenges, it's been a very slow recovery, but they're recovering. South America has got a lot of well-trained scientists and conservationists, and they've been working incredibly hard on this problem. First of all, Brazil declared these massive reserves in which there's putative protection anyway. There are patrols, and there are a lot of conservationists working to actually make otter conservation work in these reserves. Still, there are threats, even if the hunting has gone away. As you probably all well know, there are all kinds of illegal activities within the Amazon forest, including gold mining on an individual basis. People will just go out there and start gold mining on their own. Gold mining requires putting mercury into the system in order to flush the gold out. And so mercury is a heavy metal, one of the worst possible poisons for wildlife. Oil production, which is legal, but there are spills all the time. And then just habitat fragmentation, increasing human pressure all the time. So let's talk a little bit about conservation in general. Doing okay? Yeah, this is a disturbing photograph, isn't it? Sorry about that. But there is, we're going to go through, I don't know, 4 or 5 activities that are impacting wildlife in significant ways, mostly in the developing world, Asia, Africa, and illegal wildlife trade, very surprisingly, is the 3rd biggest illegal trade in the world, after drugs and human trafficking, often done by the same people. This kind of trafficking is done by very large criminal syndicates that have, you know, well worked out smuggling routes that they evade. Enforcement. I have to say, in the past 2 years, there's probably been more attention to this than there has been in the prior 20. Governments are really stepping up, especially Europe, the EU. And even Obama, about a month ago, gave $10 million to trying to enforce protection or trying to subdue the illegal traffic. Asia is the target for most of this trade, especially China, but also Southeast Asia. A lot of animals are coming out of Southeast Asia. But secondly, since waters are used so heavily by people, especially for fishing, you know, and who's going to stop people from fishing, right? So this is a more complicated problem. Otters need a prey base. They actually eat about 2.5 times their, 2.5 pounds of food a day. So they need a lot of fish. They have high metabolism. And this is a complicated and difficult issue. So is the utilization of water resources. This photograph is from Bhutan, where they have very few, they're actually trying very hard to protect their natural resources, but they have very few resources. And hydroelectric generation for sale to India is one of the big ones. So they're really disturbing the river. Promoting ecotourism would be good, but really only fits giant otters. You see how unshy these guys are? They're like going up to look at the tourists. And of course, raising awareness. And this is probably the long term, the very best way to conserve wildlife. Zoos actually give a lot of money, support research and monitoring projects, conservation projects. And one thing that I'm involved in, I think that was in your little blurb on me, is this Himalayan otter network, because the regional protection is a really good approach. And this particular region is very fragmented, politically isolated. You know, the Pakistanis can't come to any conferences, for example. Bhutanese can't be sent out of the country for training. It's difficult. So we're trying to have this work. And yeah, this is really wonderful. Nepal has just gone a whole year without any poaching of the large animals. I really don't know how they accomplished it. If you ever visit Nepal, it's just, you know, it's just shocking how difficult they are. So, and we talked about this once before in the talk, International Union for the Conservation of Nature. This is certainly the biggest, most effective worldwide group. It's got a small staff, but they have volunteer scientists and conservationists from all over the world who donate their time for conservation. And they do it in these specialist groups, of which there are, I think, 700 or something, a lot. And they produce this red list, which is very, very important because we need to know what the status of these animals are. Lots of plants and animals, including, you know, bugs and fungi and everything, are disappearing without our really knowing that they're disappearing. So this is a very effective organization. They do all kinds of things everywhere in the world. Countries are members, like the UN. This is one of their, I just love this beautiful map they made of the size of each bubble represents the number of species that are threatened. You know, I mean, for example, I think this is Peru. And look at little Sri Lanka over here, which is a tiny little island, and it's obviously got a lot of endangered species. It's really obvious that the less developed countries are the ones that are losing their. What's that? No, Brazil's over there. Yeah, Brazil's over there. Brazil hasn't got so many because it's so big. It probably does have so many, but we probably don't even know it. So this is my closing slide. You know, we really need to conserve these in order to have ecosystems that work. Even, I mean, if you just think about what happened to the sea otter and the urchins and the kelp, you can see how rapidly this kind of thing can happen. It can happen overnight, basically. So thank you very much. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Are we able to breed otters in captivity and release them into the wild?
Yes, we breed otters. Zoos breed otters, but you can't put an otter back, as you can for many, many zoo animals. Yes, we're conserving the genetic material, but if you can't put the animal back in the wild, I mean, it does happen occasionally. Przewalski's horses were conserved in zoos and then put back. You know, there's a big, expensive effort to put them back. But on the whole, once you get them out, it's not so easy to get them back. Yeah?
I have a question, but first I'd like to encourage the young people to ask any questions they may have. They're supposed to get priority on questions.
Yeah, you high school students. Yeah.
I really think it's good what you're doing. I like this a lot.
Thanks. I'd have to say, this is there's a lot of career opportunities here. You can work in this field in lots and lots of different ways, not only being a scientist. But thank you. Okay.
Melissa,
Nope.
are there any otters in Hispaniola?
I thought you and I agreed that there weren't. I think we agreed that there weren't. I think I looked it up afterwards too. I said no otters in Australia and some islands. So they're not very, otters that live in rivers are not very seaworthy. So they can't get across big gaps in oceans. And I think Hispaniola doesn't have any. They'd probably do fine there.
Excuse me?
They probably do fine.
Yeah, they probably
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. Okay.
Melissa, thank
Yeah,
you for
oh,
responding
sorry,
to all.
one more.
Other question?
Hidalgo Bay in Washington State is contiguous with the Strait of San Juan de Fuca, so it's sailing. And I saw an otter about 5 miles from the nearest freshwater inlet to Hidalgo Bay. It did not weigh anywhere near 100 pounds. So
Well.
does that mean it was a river otter who can tolerate saline water?
Well, many species of river otters that live in rivers that come down to the ocean, then live along the coast, close, and they go up, they have to, dry off, and they're not really seagoing. So I suspect that you saw, if it was anywhere away from the coast itself, that you saw a small sea otter. They're a maximum of 100.
Basically on the coast of this bay, but again, it was like, it had to traverse 5 miles of saline water to get to where it was.
Yeah. I mean, my guess is probably not, but they probably overlap in that area. Yeah.
Do you think there's any otters in like Santa Fe or Santa Fe County?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question, because remember I said somewhere along there, we reintroduced them in the Rio Pueblo de Tos, and they took off. They went up to Colorado, they went down to Cochiti, and one otter went all the way down to Cochiti Dam, and then he went up La Cienega to the town of Cienega, which is right over there. He looked around and thought, no, I'm not going to be here, and turned around and went back down to the Rio Grande. It has to, otters need quite a bit of fish. And like the Santa Fe, people keep saying, why can't we put some in the Santa Fe River? But there is not enough to eat.
Plus the flow's inconsistent.
And wait till next summer, we won't have any water in it. Yeah, it's high this year, but next summer it's going to be really low because they're going to fill the reservoir. Exactly. Okay, good.
So Melissa, thank you very much for responding.
Thanks a lot.
So